So last speaker, last build. I made a joke last night at dinner that if I never stop speaking, build doesn't end. So I'm gonna filibuster the conference. So if somebody, I didn't wear the right shoes for that, so if somebody could bring me in some New Balance shoes or something like that, I would really, really appreciate it. But honestly, it's a pretty big honor for me to sort of be in this slot. And I don't really use that word honor lightly. This place has sort of turned into an intellectual home for me over the course of the past few years. So there's been 5 builds. I've been to 3 of them. Second time speaking here, attended once. And it's just really special for me because, I guess back in 2010, I gave a talk called The Shape of Design, and it turned into this book that I funded on Kickstarter. And I don't really know if that would have been possible anywhere else. I don't know if I would have thought to have even have done that because Build is sort of like this special audience. That talk got such a warm reception that I was like, okay, there's something here. I have to do something with that. So one of the cool things about all of you is that a Build audience for a speaker, the Build audience always meets you way more than halfway. And that's really awesome. So it's cool to be able to come back. I want to thank Andy for asking me to come back. I want to thank all of you for coming. Hope you had a good day so far. And actually, I want to give double thanks to all the familiar faces that I see out there, because there is a roster of people that come back year after year after year. And that's what makes Build really, really special. Okay, so this talk. This talk is called What Screens Want. That's why it says that really big on the screen. We're going to do a typical Frank thing. We're going to go on a bit of a wild goose chase. To just sort of explore what it means to I don't know, play with light. This whole talk is focused around a big question that I've been asking myself recently. It's this: what does it mean to design natively for screens? I've been thinking about that for a while. And as weird as it sounds, I think the best place to sort of get into that is in the medicine cabinet. So these are aspirin pills. They say aspirin, that's how you tell. So I bought some for the first time in a long time, just a couple of weeks ago. And I opened the bottle, I shook some out in my hand, and I looked at them and I was like, this is really weird. These pills are a lot smaller than I remember. And I do what you normally do in that instance. I hopped online and I was like, okay, am I crazy? Are aspirin pills really smaller now? And going through Wikipedia and reading conspiracy theorists and all of that sort of stuff. Turns out that aspirin pills really are smaller now. Because the past couple decades, pharmaceutical companies, they've been able to make the active drug in the aspirin more potent. That saves the money because more potent drug means you need less of the drug inside of each pill. So these pills that you're seeing, they're hardly aspirin at all. And the current version of it is so physically minuscule that it needs to be padded with a filler substance, just so that the pill can be large enough that you can pick it up and put it in your mouth. So literally, you could not grasp it without that padding. And I read that and I had a moment where it occurred to me that we've been living through a really similar situation with computers. I mean, honestly, we're all steeped in this stuff. But have you taken a step back and taken a look at the technology in our lives right now? Taken stock of that situation. It's really changed underneath us. And I take it for granted because it's happened so fast and so thoroughly. So I think about, I don't know, for instance, my first cellular phone. It came in a bag. We called it a car phone. Now that phone fits in my pocket and I can start my car with it. That's really crazy. That's happened in 10 years, maybe, something like that. And then I think about one of my first computers, and it was super cumbersome. It was this big, awkward beige box, and it sat on this other big, awkward beige box. So you had this weird stack of things sitting in front of you all the time, and it churned and chug-a-lugged, and you can hear all the fans inside of it. It was just big and dull and dumb. But now, all of this is condensed down. It's all the same thing. So your computer is just sort of this big, shiny pane of glass. It's 30 inches, and you can see forever through it. And it sits right in front of you all day. It's totally the opposite of my first computer. So the point of all of this is, just like aspirin, we've been able to make the guts of our computers more potent, more powerful, smaller. And chances are your computer's footprint, it's entirely comprised of that screen. I mean, even this iMac right here, it's just sort of a screen with a kickstand, right? And something's happened within the past few years as well. Now we have touchscreens, like they're very popular, they're widespread. So now we're using those screens for input as well as output. So the whole feedback cycle of using a computer now, it's entirely screen-based. So talking to my sister's kids, my niece and nephews, normals, as we like to call them, people who don't work in technology, their entire conception of a computer is a screen. So if computers are like the aspirin that I was talking about earlier, and we've been making these computers smaller and smaller, what is that necessary padding that we have that allows us to grasp things? Now, it's obviously not in the physical form factor, because these things are getting tinier and thinner every single year. So instead of saying that that padding is around the screens, I want to try to make an argument that it's in the screens. I'll explain a little bit more. So computers deal with manipulating and presenting data. It's all really, really abstract. This is the configuration file for Sublime Text. And I hate this thing. Like, I do not understand it. It's too dense even for me. I'm just not willing to put in the time. So because it's so abstract, it really helps to make things visible. That's why graphical user interfaces, those were the key to unlocking computers for most people. These interfaces, that's where we put our padding. Now, this padding, it's when metaphors are made solid. In the case of software on the screen, these metaphors, they explain the functions of an interface. They provide a bridge from a familiar place, something that you know, into an unfamiliar place, something where you know less, by suggesting the function and its relationship to other tools. So for instance, if I say this is a trash bin, you may not know a computer's file management or directory structures, but you've got a pretty good idea of how trash bins work, and you sort of deduce that this is where the things that you don't want go. And those things stay there until somebody empties it out, right? Now, I think we all know that some of the aspirin pills padding is necessary in computing. Like, we need those abstractions. Otherwise, we'd just be writing code in assembly. There'd be no work designing interfaces. And no one would understand anything unless they took the years to understand it natively. Computers, after all, they're just shaky, leaky towers, one abstraction inside of another. From the code that tells them what to do, to the interfaces that suggest to users what's possible to do with them. So abstractions are necessary, and padding is useful in explaining these complicated invisible things. But the choice of how much padding to introduce is really tricky, because there's no fixed amount. There's no right amount. We're all coming to it from different amounts of experience, and that experience matters more here than in most places, because exposure to the interface allows you to learn more abstract concepts. And it's not like that everywhere. Meaning, the size of that aspirin pill with the padding inside of it, it's constrained by the size of your fingers. Like, it has a minimum size, because if it gets smaller than that minimum size, it's just really tough to pick up. It's not like that with your brain, because your brain can become more keen to abstractions. It learns. It normalizes those patterns. So you can eventually shrug off the metaphors, a bit like taking the training wheels off of a bike. I think we've been living through that shedding process, and the interfaces of iOS 7 and Windows Metro, they suggest the keenness of our minds and our adeptness at learning interfaces. Like, there's not really a lot to grab onto here, but still, it seems to work pretty okay for a lot of people. So, like it or not, I have some problems with these things. But still, Metro and iOS 7, they're major touchstones in our relationships to computing, because it means that we're beginning to accept a flexible medium on its own terms. Now, it's not the first time we've done something like this. I want to go back 35 years. I'm going to show you a video clip. It's a couple minutes long. It's from a BBC television special called Connections. And it's hosted by a guy that I really respect a lot. His name's James Burke.
Have you noticed what's happened to plastic in the last 10 years? It's become something in its own right. I mean, early on, if you made something in plastic, you had to make it look exactly like what it was replacing. I mean, particularly leather, or people wouldn't buy it. It's not so long since the word plastic was an insult. Cheap and nasty, remember? Not anymore. It's as if we suddenly changed our attitude to what real meant and recognized plastic for what it is. Something that permits us to own objects that we couldn't possibly afford if they had to be made in the so-called real thing. So now it's everywhere. I mean, look at this office. That's plastic. So's that. So are these. So is this, and especially what's inside it. There's plastic paint on the wall. There's plastic wood on this desk. My shirt is plastic. And now there's a new generation of objects that can only be made in plastic, like that cassette. It's a plastic world. And because of plastic, it's a plastic world in a different sense, in the original sense of the word. It changes its shape easily. So now we no longer buy the thing we want, we buy the shape of that thing that we prefer. And when the shapes change regularly, which they do, we begin to want them to change regularly.
So good. So good. I don't need to tell you that it's the 70s. You can just look at him and be like, oh, that's 1976 right there. Everything that he says, does that sound familiar at all to you? I'm trying to suss out a pattern here. The progression of plastics, it's the same as what we've had with screens and software. It's a pattern that you see in any kind of malleable medium, meaning if something can become anything, it usually becomes everything. Now, as a little formal exercise, I'm going to go back through Burke's little spiel there. And every time that he says plastic, I'm going to say software, OK? And I will change the examples. And we're going to have some fun here, OK? And I also promise I'm not going to try to do a British accent, because that would just be a total train wreck. OK, you guys ready? We're going to do this. Have you noticed what's happened to software in the last 10 years? It's become something in its own right. I mean, early on, if you made something in software, you had to make it look exactly like what it was replacing. I mean, particularly leather, or people wouldn't buy it. It's not been long since the word software was an insult. Nasty and complicated, remember? Not anymore. It's as if we suddenly changed our attitude to what real meant and recognized software for what it is. Something that permits us to do things we couldn't possibly do if they had to be made out with the so-called real thing. Now it's everywhere. I mean, look at this office. This is now software. So's that. So is this. And so are these. And especially what's inside of them. There's software on the wall. There's software on this desk. My shoes are software. And now there's a new generation of objects that can only be made in software. It's a software world. And because of software, it's a soft world in a different sense, in the original sense of the word. It changes shape easily. So now we no longer buy the thing we want. We buy the shape of the thing we prefer. And when the shapes change regularly, which they do, we begin to want them to change regularly. All right. Whew. So when Burke talks about things needing to look like their old embodiments and the ability for those shapes to change, he's talking about skeuomorphs. But he would never, ever, ever use that word because he's just much too clever for that. I mean, the word is just, I don't know, it's like sharp and pointy and it sticks in your mouth and it's tough to say. And I'm kind of a dumbass for saying that word so much in this talk from here on out. The word's Greek, like most good words. Comes from Greek, two halves. Skeuo for container and morph means shape. So skeuomorphs are about the shape that we choose for the containers that we build. So this requires plasticity, softness. And I think screens are a special material without much precedent. I tried to think of a lot of things, and the only thing that I could think of was plastic. And I really do think that it's best to view screens as a material for web design, for interaction design, for interface design. And just like any material, screens have affordances. Much like wood, I believe screens have a grain, a certain way that they've grown and matured that describes how they want to be treated. The grain is what gives a material its identity. It tells you the best way to use it. So if you figure out the grain, you know how to design natively for screens, and you answer the question I had at the beginning of the talk. And we've tried to figure that out. oh my God, we've tried so hard, especially in the past few years. Unfortunately, the discussion about how to natively design for screens feels a bit stunted in its current form because we're stuck in a pendulum swing. So there's two main ideological camps sort of going up against one another here. On the one side, you have proponents for flat design. So the folks who say because screens are flat, the designs should be too. And we need to remove any hint or reference to the three-dimensional world because computing is something else entirely. On the other side, you have the folks who believe in the value of skeuomorphs as tangible, visible metaphors. So this is the tribe of people who love lickable buttons, realistic textures, folding paper, stitched leather, all of that sort of stuff. Now, I think any reasonable person would say that the best approach here is probably somewhere in the middle. But I think both of those arguments fall short because they're based on aesthetics and how things look. Now, leaning on aesthetics makes sense. I mean, it's a tempting argument to make. Screens are output devices after all, right? But I think it's a shallow answer to a deep question. So I'm going to do my best to refute both of those arguments. And I'm going to do it with horses. Because horses are cool, and I'm going to have to circle back around to horses in a minute, so I might as well just get you used to the idea, okay? Get ready. All right, so here's a color photo of a horse. Quite majestic. Here's a black and white photo of a horse. Here's a drawing of a horse that I am just now realizing I neglected to take the watermark out of. This is a famous painting with a horse. Here's a flat horse. Here's a skeuomorphic horse. And here's all of the horses together. Black and white, color, flat, round, drawn, whatever. That proves it. The point being that you just saw all of those different kinds of horses on a screen. And that screen did perfectly fine showing all of them to you. A screen doesn't care what you put on it any more than a sheet of paper cares what you print on it. Screens are aesthetically neutral. So the looks of things aren't a part of their grain. So sorry, internet people that like to talk about this stuff. You should just own it. If you want to make something flat, then do it and say, hey, look, it's flat, deal with it. But you shouldn't say that you did it because that's what screens want, and that's like a thing native to screens. There's other reasons to make things flat, but saying that the screen wants it isn't one of them. So how do you figure out that grain? Well, if you think about it, grain's a documentation of how a tree's grown. So maybe the best thing to do is to figure out where screens came from. So now I get to go back, I get to talk about horses again, and we're going to go through a little short history lesson, all right? So in 1872, a man took a photograph of a horse. There's our horse. This doesn't really seem like a significant achievement, but about 140 years later, I think that it's probably the best starting point to suss out screens and describe them. This is the photo, and I think it's probably familiar to quite a few of you. It was taken by a British man named Edward Muybridge, who lived in California in a place we now call Silicon Valley. In fact, this photo right here was staged in Palo Alto, just a few blocks away from the old Facebook headquarters. This photo on its own isn't that extraordinary, but I think the important thing is that there wasn't just one photo. There were 12. All of them taken in the span of just a few seconds. Now, these photos were originally taken to settle a bet between a couple guys. They were arguing about whether or not all four of a horse's hooves were off the ground at any point in their stride. So they hired Muybridge, he set up his fancy cameras, they took these photos, and lo and behold, there is one point where all four hooves are off the ground. Now, aside from that bet, I think Muybridge's little photo project has profound effects on how we understand time and movement. See, these horses were the first time a man has ever split the second. We all think that splitting the atom is this huge deal because we can see its consequences. But I think that splitting the second is just as profound. Because when you split time that thinly, and you take these 12 photos and put them back together in rapid sequence, they do this. And I'm sure this is what you were waiting for this to do. This doesn't really seem like that big of a deal for us now, but photography up until that point required the subject to stay extremely still. So the idea of photographing a running horse was just like a no-no. So you have to stay still, otherwise it's going to blur. So it meant that before MyBridge and these horse photos, the photos could refer to life, but they could never really capture its essence, movement. And MyBridge did whatever any reasonable inventor would do. He says, OK, I figured out how to bottle movement, so now I need to figure out how to unbottle it. How do I reanimate what I froze? So his first attempts at doing this, to recreate movement, were to print the photographs radially on a glass disc, spin it while it was lit from behind. He called that a zoopraxis scope, another tricky word. So here's a zoopraxis scope projection at work, something really similar to it. Now, light's coming from behind, and you can see that that light is landing on a surface. And lo and behold, look, we've got a screen. Let's go ahead and pan in here so you can see some examples. Now, these are not photographic animations like MyBridge's, but it's the same concept. And you know, what's crazy is like, these actually predate MyBridge's photographs by a little bit. But they seem really similar to animated GIFs, don't they? It's like the 19th century version of Tumblr right here. And it's really cool to think that like ever since we had screens, we have had some form of really short, really bizarre, loopable animations involving animals and cats and stuff. It's just like in it, like you get the screens and then you get like animals doing weird stuff. It's great. They just go together. So MyBridge's crazy horse experiment eventually led us to the familiar glow of the screen. And when you look at what we do in light of this knowledge, I think it becomes obvious that web and interaction design is just as much a child of filmmaking as it is as graphic design. And maybe even more so. Because after all, I mean, yes, we do both work on screens, but we also manage time. We manage movement. And most importantly, and most interesting for me, we manage change. So what does all this mean? Well, I think the grain of screens has been there since the beginning, and it's not tied to an aesthetic. Screens don't care what the horses look like. They only want them to move. They want them to change. So for me, I believe that designing for screens is to manage that change. And to put a finer head on it, I believe the grain of screens is something that I call flux. All right, so what is flux? Flux is the capacity for something to change. Yeah, it could be animation like the stuff that I just showed you, and that's largely what I've been talking about up until now. But I think it's a lot more too. Flux is sort of it's a big umbrella, it's a generous definition, and I think it allows for a lot of the things that we take for granted in the digital realm. So it's not just about animation, but also structural changes as well. Things like customization, responsiveness, and variability. So I'll give you some examples. Flux is changing the colors on your website at night to customize for a different reading environment, different amounts of light surrounding the screen. Flux is having some fun with a fashion lookbook if you know it's going to be mostly seen on screens, literally making your product come to life. Flux is building a responsive website for a little company because screens come in all shapes and sizes, and the browser window on some of those screens come in all sizes as well. So adapting the content and the layout of that content to work well at whatever the screen gives you. It's having a malleable identity system for your company if the main medium is screens. It's using movement to more clearly describe the steps of a complicated process. So these are a few GIFs showing you how to tie a bow tie. And I'm really convinced that this is the best way to teach somebody a procedural, step-by-step process. Why? Because it's one step at a time and it loops. It's so great. And flexes, I mean, I don't know. Like, I just saw this site yesterday, and I had to like throw it in. This is Polygon's review website for the PS4, and I just thought it was awesome. Like, it was just a really great execution of where we are on the web right now. It's a great balance of responsiveness. It has high readability, and it has like flexiness. Like, I don't think flexiness is a word, but I just told you what flux means, so like I get to use it from now on. Okay? So those are some examples of flux, and I'm sure that you guys could think of a lot more just in the work that you're doing right now. When I think about the ways that I've used it in my work and the things that I've seen and come across, I start to sort of grade them based on how much it leans on flux. Sort of break it down into 3 levels for myself. So first there's low flux. So this is like really small mutations that I don't think we even notice anymore with computing. So for instance, like the ability to sort a table row in your spreadsheet software, right? One of the major reasons that spreadsheet software has the capacity to change is not only because there's a processor hooked up to it, but because there's a screen hooked up to it and it can represent those changes and show them to you. That's kind of a duh thing, but like you can't do that without a screen, so like that's an affordance of screens. On the other end of this, we'll call it a spectrum, there's high flux. So this is like immersive interactivity and like really sort of like bonkers animations, like the thing that I just showed you with all the horses. You probably think of this sort of stuff when I'm like Flash website, right? You see like buttons flying all over the place, you hear sound and zoomy stuff. And in general, like that sort of stuff doesn't really work that well on the web, but we're talking about screens in general, and I've seen really emotionally affecting executions of high flux in places like museums and galleries, even weirdly enough, theme parks. High flux is great in physical spaces. But what's most interesting to me is this idea of medium flux. It feels like this is a door that's just recently opened up to us, or something that we've just become mindful of with the web recently. So it overlaps the most with what I do from day to day, which is websites and interfaces. So medium level, it's assistive and descriptive animation. It's restructuring content based on sensors. So it clarifies interactivity by allowing those elements to respond to that interaction. The most run-of-the-mill, everyday example of this is like the genie minimization animation that you have whenever you minimize a window on OS X. This is probably my favorite slide in the whole talk, by the way. So that's just one small example, but I'll show you a few more sort of generic ones. So these animations I'm about to show you, these come from a great blog post by Adrian Zumbrunnin. I want to make sure I'm saying his name right. He works for IA in Zurich. So this one, it shows animated scrolling. So after you click on the navigation item, the page scrolls down. So it helps you understand the path you took to get to a certain spot on the page, and it preserves context. It's very useful. This next one is, it's called a stateful toggle, meaning that these supplemental form elements displace the original list. And that allows the designer to consolidate space. But more importantly, I think it also infers a relationship between these two modes of adding something to the list and viewing the list. This is a sticky label. If you've ever used an iPod or an iPhone, you know what this is. It just keeps useful metadata, contextual information handy and visible. And last, this is a comment field with progressive disclosure. So you don't actually see form elements until you meet it. So the designer gets to reduce the UI elements to avoid confusion, and then whenever things do come up, the animation aids the user in understanding the origin of that new stuff. Now, what I just showed you was essentially animated wireframes. And the thing I want you to take away from those examples is that designing how things change and move is usually enough for us to understand what they are and the relationships between them. So you don't need the heavy-handed visual metaphor. As long as it moves right or behaves appropriately, you understand it. So the information is baked into the behavior, not the aesthetics. Point being that movement, change, and flux, they're a lot more than a way to delight users, which is typically the way that we've been painting it inside of the community up until this point. I think this stuff, it's a functional method for design. So design work is not only how things look, but it's also the behaviors in response to the interaction. It's the adjustments that those elements make between their fixed states. And I would say that, in fact, designing the way that elements adapt, the way that they morph in those in-between moments, is half of your work as a designer. So this is my very helpful and scientific chart here. So your tasks are, as a designer, if you're working in an interactive, malleable medium, if you're working on a screen, half of it is designing what it looks like, and then I think the other half is designing how it behaves. It kind of looks like a Pokemon ball, doesn't it? So this is what work looks like. And work has been crazy frustrating for me for the past couple of years, mostly because of that blue half of the pie chart. Because when you try to work with people to decide and produce how it behaves, it's hard to work together because you don't have words. So I've worked on a few responsive projects in the past couple of years, and it's always been a headache. And the headaches have nothing to do with technological limitations. It's mostly because I would have no idea how to express what I wanted to the other people that I was working with. I didn't have the right tools to prototype it. And more importantly, I didn't have the right language to say those words. So I would just make sounds like a total idiot. It's like, it just goes, whoosh, and then it's over here, and then it's up there, but it comes in, and then it's gone, and then nobody understands that but me. So it's actually a really terrible way to talk to people, because first off, they don't know what you're saying. Second off, they're just generally afraid of you. So not good, not good. So what I would do then is I would be like, okay, I have to prototype this. So I would jump into code, I would do some markup, I would write some CSS, and I would waste a lot of time writing non-production code to prototype something so the developer could see it. And that's really wasteful. What we've been doing as a community is focusing on making tools that allow us to prototype quicker. But I think that that's only half of the battle. We need words as well, because if you have the right word, it has a specific meaning. And if it has a specific meaning, the other person understands, so you don't even need to prototype it to begin with. So deciding on words, defining words, seems to be a great use of time for all of this stuff. So what we need to do as a community, I think, is work to develop a language of transformation so we can talk to one another. These are just a few words. There's probably a lot more. We'll probably have to invent some as well. But there's a lot of places where we can steal words too. We can look to places like animation. We can look to theater. We can look to dance and choreography. Anybody whose job it is to arrange elements inside of a space and then have those elements in that space adjust, move, and work together to some plan. Those are the people that we need to look to for guidance here. And words matter, I think. They're abstractions too. So words are an interface to thought and understanding through communication. Nicole talked about this a little bit. So the words we use mold our perception of the world around us. They become a frame, just like the interfaces that we design on the apps that we're building or the websites that we're working on. So last year at Build, Ethan Marcotte gave a lecture called "The Map is Not the Territory." It was a talk about abstractions, looked at through the lens of maps, geography, and physical terrain. And I've watched that talk, I think, 3 times now. And the longer I consider Ethan's thoughts, the more I think it's an apt metaphor for our current situation. Being builders of interfaces in a technology-laden, abstracted, mediated, and interface world, if you make those abstractions, you hold sway. Rather than trying to make that case myself, I'm going to do something that I do a lot. So I'm going to show you a clip from The West Wing that actually does a much, much better job of this for me.
Hi, I'm sorry.
Hello.
Sorry to be late.
Not a problem.
I'm CJ Craig.
Of course you are. I'm Dr. John Fallow. This is Dr. Cynthia Sales and Professor Donald Huke.
Hugh.
Huke.
Okay, and you are the Organization of Cartographers for Social Equality.
Well, we're from the OCSE. We have many members.
How many?
4,300 dues-paying members.
What are the dues?
$20 a year for the newsletter.
Let's start.
Wait, I want to see this.
This is Josh Lyman.
Indeed you are.
Josh, this is Dr. Fallow, and
Hi.
who's Mary Men.
Yes.
Should we begin?
Yes. Plain and simple, we'd like President Bartlett to aggressively support legislation that would make it mandatory for every public school in America to teach geography using the Peters projection map instead of the traditional Mercator.
Give me $200 and it's done.
Really?
No. Why are we changing maps?
Because, CJ, the Mercator projection has fostered European imperialist attitudes for centuries and created an ethnic bias against the Third World.
Really?
The German cartographer, Mercator, originally designed this map in 1569 as a navigational tool for European sailors.
The map enlarges areas at the poles to create straight lines of constant bearing or geographic direction.
So it makes it easier to cross an ocean.
But
Yes.
it distorts the relative size of nations and continents.
Are you saying the map is wrong?
Oh dear, yes. Look at Greenland.
Okay.
Now look at Africa.
Okay.
The two land masses appear to be roughly the same size.
Yes.
Would it blow your mind if I told you that Africa is in reality 14 times larger?
Yes?
Here we have Europe, drawn considerably larger than South America. When it's 6.9 million square miles, South America is almost double the size of Europe's 3.8 million.
Alaska appears 3 times as large as Mexico, when Mexico is larger by 0.1 million square miles.
Germany appears in the middle of the map when it's in the northernmost quarter of the Earth.
Wait. Relative size is one thing, but you're telling me that Germany isn't where we think it is?
Nothing's where you think it is.
Where is it?
I'm glad you asked. The Peters projection.
It has fidelity of axis.
Fidelity of position.
East-west lines are parallel and intersect north-south axes at right angles.
What the hell is that?
It's where you've been living this whole time. Should we continue?
Uh-huh.
So good. It's just so good. That's way better than I could have done. So maps are abstractions. They attempt to express the unexpressible by distorting reality into something presentable and understandable, something useful. So for instance, like time is hard to understand, but a calendar is a map to the territory of time. But an abstraction can only give you one facet of a complex reality. And things get bad when those abstractions become the terms that your mind uses to consider the thing itself. You mistake the map for the territory. And it's funny how those maps begin to mold your understanding of the world around you. So, for instance, a couple years ago, I took a flight from Chicago to Hong Kong, and the flight path took us over the North Pole. I didn't even know that was possible, first off. And secondly, it blew my mind, and I felt kind of bad because, yeah, I'll admit, I forgot that the Earth was round because I spent so much of my time looking at maps. My brain was programmed with the maps. So I forgot that you could go directions other than just east and west. So an abstraction's distortions blinded me to a portion of reality. I mean, abstractions, they always distort and omit because they have to. The trick is to be mindful that this is happening. So there's nothing saying that maps could look like this. Or even like this. Like, who says north is up, right? So for the characters in that West Wing clip, they misunderstood the relative size of nations and their actual positions on the globe because the map in their mind was made for easy sea navigation. So the accuracy of the sea came at the cost of the land. And when I realized that, a little light went off in my head. That any map's biases do service to one need, but they actually distort, misinform, and confuse people who have different needs. And that's how I feel about the web these days. We have a map of the web, and it's not for me. So I'm distant. It feels like things are distorted, and I'm constantly confused. See, we have our own abstractions on the web, and they're bigger than the user interfaces of websites and the apps that we build. They're the abstractions we use to define the web, the commercial web, the things that have sprung up in the past 10 years, but gained considerable speed in the past 5 since build started. It's the business structures and funding models we use to create our businesses. It's the pressure to scale simply because it's easy to copy bits. It's the relationships between the people who make the stuff and the people who use that stuff, and the consistent abandonment of users by entrepreneurs. It's the churning and the burning. It's flipping companies. It's nickeling and diming users with in-app purchases. It's designing dark patterns so that users can't walk away from your tools or accidentally do actions that are against their own self-interest. Listen, I'm in the middle of a 4-month sabbatical right now. And the further I get from all of that stuff, the more it begins to look like the nonsense that it is. It's just plain toxic. But these toxic elements are the predominant map we have of the web right now. The shame is we used to have a map of a frontier that could be anything. And increasingly, I get sadder and sadder because it's beginning to feel like we saw that frontier and we decided to pave it, turn it into a suburb, and build a mall. And I hate this map of the web because it only describes a fraction of it. We've made an abstraction of connection and distorted it to commodify attention. And I think that's one of the sleaziest things you can do. So what's the answer? I found this quote by Ted Nelson. He's the guy who invented hypertext. He's one of those original rebel technologists, so he has a lot of things to say about how things are right now. So here's what he said. The computer world is not yet finished, but everyone is behaving as if everything was known. This is not true. In fact, the computer world as we know it is based upon one tradition that has been waddling along for the last 50 years, growing in size and ungainliness, and is essentially defining the way we do everything. My view is that today's computer world is based on techie misunderstandings of human thought and human life. And the imposition of inappropriate structures throughout the computer is the imposition of inappropriate structures on the things we want to do in the human world. I'm going to read that again. The imposition of inappropriate structures throughout the computer is the imposition of inappropriate structures on things we want to do in the human world. It's pretty dense. So what's Nelson saying? First, he's saying that technology is shining back on us. We made it, and now it's making us. So the abstractions that we've chosen, the ones that we've made, they have distortions. And those distortions are hurting us, and they're reducing us. But the most important thing, the silver lining, is that he's also saying that we need more maps. Like Ethan's talk said, the map is not the territory. So a bad map doesn't necessarily mean bad territory. Our saving grace is that one territory, in this case, internet, technology, it can have more than one map. We can make maps that distort less, or at least accurately represent our goals for all of this technology. The land comes at the cost of the sea, remember? So maps support the values of those who make them, and they distort everything else. So if your goal is a poker game for rich old white guys, we have a really good map right now. But I'm not that, and I will never be that. So I think it's in our best interest to work on a new map, a new vision for the web, a new role for technology. So we can produce a vision of the web that isn't based on consolidation, privatization, power, hierarchies, and surveillance. We can make a new map, or maybe reclaim a map that we misplaced a long time ago, one built on extensibility, openness, communication, communities, and honestly, the one that I miss the most, wildness. We can use the efficiency and power of interfaces to help people do what they already want to do, more quickly and more enjoyably. And we can build up business structures so that it's okay for them to put down that technology and get on with their life outside of it once their job's done. We only need to say that this is important, and then we need to work towards it. So let me leave you with this. The point of this talk was to ask what screens want. And I think that's a really great question. But it needs to match up with what we want. People believe that there's an essence to the computer, that there's a true and correct way to do things. But there's no right way. We get to choose how to aim the technology that we build. At least for now, because increasingly, technology feels like something that happens to you instead of something you use. And we need to figure out how to stop that for all of our sakes. One of the reasons I'm so fascinated by screens is because their story is our story. It's one of metamorphosis. It's one of change. Screens have flux, and so do we. We have that capacity for change. So the pep talk is, I feel like things are starting to suck. But there's a capacity for change in what we've made and who we are. Because all abstractions are man-made. Everything was made, and if we want, we can remake it to what we see fit. We only need to want it. Then we have to build it. Thanks.